Welcome again to the Dr. Warren Gage podcast, and we are looking at Job's closing argument, his case that he would present to God himself. And last time we noted that it occurs in the last 5 chapters, but actually the culmination of it is the last 3 chapters. So last week he looked at 29. In chapter 29, he's looking at the way life was formerly before the trials came upon him, the way he prospered and the way he was regarded in the community. And he laments the loss of all of that. He recalls that he thought that if he walked in integrity, he would not suffer. And now he is suffering. And so having looked at longingly at the past, now he looks at the present. And the present is in chapter 30, so we look at part 2 of his closing argument, his conditions and how they are now and how they afflict him, and how he's not able to put them together because he has no known sin that would merit that kind of suffering, and he has a hard time juxtaposing his present suffering with his past prosperity, walking in obedience, when he still intends to walk in obedience. So it's a tremendous dilemma that leads to extraordinary mental and psychic suffering, as well as physical. So now looking at his present condition, he says, "But now they," that is, those who once held him in such extraordinary honor, "mock at me, men younger than I, whose fathers I disdain to put with the dogs of my flock." He says, young men mock him. There is no regard for his being an elder because he's lost his reputation and his calamity in the circumstances of his situation. He says, young men mock at me, and these young men, their fathers, I wouldn't have put to watch the dogs over my flock. That is the most menial of jobs, to watch the unclean dogs who cared for his flock. He said they weren't worthy to be in his employ, even in the lowest possible position. And then Job continues, "Indeed, what profit is the strength of their hands to me?" They wouldn't have profited him, and what does it profit him now? Their vigor is perished, and they are gaunt from want and famine. So these are the ones whose sons are mocking him. The ones who have lost their strength are gaunt, that is, they're wasted from famine. They can't feed themselves, fleeing late into the wilderness, desolate and waste. So they have no prosperity in and of themselves, and now their sons are mocking poor Job. He says they pluck mallow by the bushes and broom tree roots for their food. The mallow is a little confusing to me. Mallow is, in English, it speaks of a particular kind of flower. Mauve is the French word for it, and that's the color of it. That comes in English as a color. It used to be an ingredient when they first developed the idea of the marshmallow, and that's what this would be, the marshmallow. Present day, they don't use this flour anymore, and its product. They use gelatin, so it's not the same thing. It is edible, but it's kind of weak in its flavor. He said they pluck mallow by the bushes. It's a very primitive kind of meager food. And the broom tree root, now that I understand, the broom tree grows in the desert, and so its root is very hard and can be bitter. So this is all the food that they can find, is what they can forage, and there's not much to it. Certainly no flavor. There's no delicacy to it at all. He says they were driven out from among men. He's speaking still of the fathers of these young men who were mocking him. They shouted at them as a thief. So they saw them running away. They drove them out of the city, out of the community of civilization, as it were. They shouted at them as a thief. That is, they were thieves. They were regarded as thieves. They had to live in the clefts of the valley and caves of the earth and rocks. This is an image that the author of Hebrews uses for the righteous who were persecuted. They lived in caves, that is, in the realm of Sheol. The cleft in the rock is an emblem of Sheol. Remember that Moses stood in the cleft of the rock, and God put his hand over it. It was like a cave, and he put his hand over it, so it's like he's buried. And when he comes forth, standing, the posture is the posture of resurrection. He sees the afterglow of the glory of God, which is all he can tolerate in with his eyesight, without being consumed by the glory of God. And so when he's in the cleft of the rock, it's a picture of the mortality of man, because they would bury in the clefts of the rock and in the caves. He says, among the bushes they brayed like an animal, and under the nettles they nestled. Bushes they brayed like dogs, and under the nettles they nestled. That's a very uncomfortable conjunction of imagery here. They found their nest under the nettles. Those are thorny plants, and they were sons of fools. So we've got 3 generations to look at. These were the sons who were driven out from the city, and their sons remain to mock Job in the catastrophes that have come upon him. They were sons of fools, yes, sons of vile men. They were accursed from the land. They were scourged, rather, from the land, driven out by whips. So these are the people who are outcast, and their sons now who remain in the community are mocking Job. So obviously they've had no discipline at home, no example from the fathers, and they have themselves shown themselves to be corrupt. And that evidence is that they cannot see that Job is a man worthy of respect and honor. And now I am their taunting song. They sing about his misery. As he had made the tongue of the widow to sing for joy, for his caring of her, now his tongue, or their tongues are given. He has become their song. They torment him by their singing. It's a perversion of music, actually, to do those kinds of things, to call out in scorn. He said, yes, I am their byword. He's been made a byword. And I've commented on that before. A byword here is, it's don't act like Job. It would be, or you'll meet the fate of Job, which I think is the idea. Whereas James holds him up in honor and said, you've heard of his perseverance. He has become a byword. He's a byword in the book of James, but he's a monument to strength and perseverance. So he said, but he'd become their byword of one to whom God had showed contempt. I think there's a vicious aspect in the heart of man when he sees something that is weak and broken. You see that in animals, small animals, cats and dogs, but cats particularly. If a bird falls and its wing is broken, it's just prey, and they torture and torment it. There's an aspect of that, I think, the bestial in mankind too, to mock someone who has some disability or weakness in mental acuity, perhaps. To mock someone like that just shows a particular kind of bestial cruelty. He says, they abhor me, they keep far from me, they keep a distance, fearing that they will be contaminated by his catastrophe. They do not hesitate to spit in my face, the most appalling insult you can do. And of course, they spit upon Christ in an odd context, because the spittle ran down his beard, which is the language that's used to describe the oil of anointing that falls down on Aaron's beard in Psalm 133. But he is anointed by the spittle of the Sanhedrin. So they abhor me, they keep me far from them. They do not hesitate to spit in my face. Why? Because God has loosed my bowstring and afflicted me. And again, the bow speaks of the strength of the warrior, and he has no strength. The image of that is his bowstring. He can't string his bow anymore. And remember, we had said before, he had said, when he talked about the days of his prosperity in the last chapter, verse 20, my glory is fresh within me, and my bow is renewed in my hand. but he can't string it. This again brings to mind the scene in Ithaca when Odysseus confronts the suitors of Penelope, and she uses various clever devices to forestall their demand that she marry one of them, and one of them is that they need to string his bow, the bow of Ulysses, to show that they're equal to ask her hand, and none of them can do it. And of course, when Ulysses comes in the disguise of a beggar, he just immediately stretches the string on the bow, and then he begins to shoot it through the axe heads and show that there's no one like him, and then he takes his vengeance on these wicked suitors. So all of that imagery, I think, comes to life in its context. He's saying, God has loosed my bowstring and afflicted me. He's taken away his strength. He's not able to string his bow and make war. He says, they have cast restraint off before me, and at my right hand the rabble arises. His right hand is the emblem of his strength in a man. And here he says, at my right hand the rabble arouses. They push away my feet, and they raise against me their ways of destruction. So they see that he's weakened, and so now they, who perhaps had resentments toward him, take the opposite side of anything that he suggests. They break up my path. They promote my calamity. How do you promote calamity? You gossip about it. You speak about it. And in terms that suggest that God has abandoned him. And how offensive that would be to God, because God has not abandoned him. I think we should be very careful in the way that we interpret misfortune that comes to others, and the way that we speak about it and assume at whose hand it is coming. Because the same counsel that Job will receive from the Lord should be ours. We should be careful. There are things and dramas that are being engaged in this life that we know little of. So he says, they break my path. They promote my calamity. They have no helper. They come as broad breakers under the ruinous storm. They roll along. Terrors are turned upon me. They pursue my honor as the wind, as an empty thing, as a thing of no weight, no substance. They pursue his honor, that is, they tell the story of Job, which in their eyes discredits him, and so they seek to bring that discredit upon others. It's very indicative of character how we speak of others after matters of judgment. What things are stated on the internet, and then now you can magnify your sin in moments around the world. So we live in dangerous days, it seems to me. He said, and now my soul is poured out because of my plight. The days of affliction take hold of me. So he's looking at his present condition, and it's a lament. There's nothing encouraging. He says, my bones are pierced in me at night, and my gnawing pains take no rest. So he has no comfort in daytime, no comfort at night. It's miserable all the time. He says his bones are pierced. That's the strength of a body, is the bone structure, and that's giving way. By great force my garment is disfigured. It binds me about as the collar of my coat. He, that is God, has cast me into the mire, into the dust, into the mud out of which man was taken. He has cast me into the mire, thrown it away as something unclean, I think is what he intends. And I have become like dust and ashes. And that's the destiny of man. From dust you came, and to dust you will return. That's the destiny of man. And now, although he is still living, he has come to that place where he is regarded as being among the dead and unclean. Now he shifts to prayer, interestingly. He's no longer addressing the ones who speak calumny against him. He's not addressing his enemies or those who misunderstand. He's addressing God himself. He said, I cry out to you, but you do not answer me. This is that tza'ak that begins every lament psalm. I cry out to you, O Lord. He says, but you do not answer me. I stand up, and you regard me, but you have become cruel to me. That becomes very close to an accusation. And I think we should contextually remember that he has no known sin to him that is of such a magnitude to warrant such a destruction. And so, from the human perspective, comparing the past and the present, it's like God has turned his fortunes. God, and there are no fortunes, of course, God's hand is on all. But it's like God has apportioned a cruel feast for him. And there's an ironic purpose in that. I know that Christ pleads with the Lord to take the cup away from him. And that cup was the extraordinary suffering that was far greater than Job's. But the Bible says that it pleased God to crush him. But God had a far greater purpose in mind. Jesus had the book of Job to comfort him. And I'm sure he would be thinking of these circumstances, but he would have to drink a bitter cup that was unrighteously due to him in order to accomplish a far greater righteousness that God intended. So much was at stake in the way that he addressed his own suffering, and he did it. He was commanded, by the way, to be joyful on that day. Psalm 118, this is the day the Lord has made, refers to the day of his passion, and he must rejoice and be glad in it. And Hebrews tells us that for the joy that was set before him, looking to the future, he was able to summon up that joy to be obedient to that psalm. But it's the only thing I can compare it to is to what Job is going through is to Christ himself. He says, you have become cruel to me. And Jesus never said that. With the strength of your hand, you oppose me. You lift me up to the wind and cause me to ride on it. That is, he's twisting in the wind, I think we say, is something of the same figurative import. That is, the wind which has no weight. You're just turning. It's like you're hanging, suspended, with no footing, no foundation. You lift me up to the wind and cause me to ride on it. You spoil my success. For I know that you will bring me to death and to the house appointed for all living. He knows that his end is going to be in death, in mortal death. He thought that he would multiply his days like the sand of the sea and live in the favor of God and nested in the favor of God over his tent. But now he's close to death himself. Everything that he had loved is dead, and his flesh now is afflicted with precursors of death. And he knows that that's his destiny. He recognizes his mortality and that he must return to that dust from which he came. He said, surely he would not stretch out his hand against a heap of ruins. So now he's left prayer and he's considering God himself. Why would God stretch out his hand against a ruin if they cry out when he destroys it? Why would he not expect someone to cry out when he is the one who destroys it? And we know, of course, that it is Satan. But ultimately, Satan is an agent. God's purpose is that Job should go through this kind of suffering. Have I not wept for him who was in trouble? And he thinks about himself. When he would hear of someone in such a catastrophic condition, he would weep for them and show sympathy for them, even if they had committed the act that had caused their own catastrophe. Has not my soul grieved for the poor? So now we're returning back to chapter 29 in some sense, when we think about how he would grieve for someone in Job's condition, and he would have sought to help. But when I looked for good, evil came to me, and when I waited for light, then came darkness. That's the lament of the soul who doesn't understand why he's suffering. And it's so poignant in the way that it's described. When he looked for good, evil came to him. And when he waited for light, he knew only darkness. But isn't God supposed to be a light for us in darkness that we might not stumble, and his light not to be given to us that we might walk in the light and not in the darkness. But that has been taken away from him, or so he sees. My heart is in turmoil and cannot rest. Days of affliction confront me. But these things are imponderable. He cannot understand them. And that increases, it heightens his torment. The physical pain, the emotional loss of all that he'd loved and known. And now he cannot put together. Life makes no sense at all. Utterly makes no sense. He says, I go about mourning, but not in the sun. I stand up in the assembly and cry out for help. He says, I am a brother of jackals and a companion of ostriches. These are unclean animals. The jackals were known to inhabit the necropolis, the cemetery of the city. The city of the dead is what necropolis literally means. And so the jackal-headed god of the Egyptians is Anubis, who is the god of mummification, death. You always see Anubis at the judgment scene, like in the Hall of Judgment, the Scroll of the Dead, the Book of the Dead. So the jackal is a place that is unclean. It's outside. It lives among the dead. It's just the worthless. And he says, I am a brother of jackals. That he's lost his own humanity. He's become almost an animal and regarded as someone that's unclean, especially unclean because he's in the companion of the dead. I'm a companion of ostriches. The ostrich is, in the Bible, is known as one that doesn't have wisdom. The contrast is with the stork that the Bible makes. And the stork cares for its young. It makes a nest high up in the chimneys. I know when I was in school in Austria, Burgenland is the border into Hungary. And in Hungary and in Austria, in the high chimneys, you'll see nests, and that's where the stork makes their nest and lays their eggs. They're not, the chimneys are not in use, of course, at the season of nesting. But they protect their young from being on the ground where there would be anyone that would harm the young. And so they make the nest, and then they feed the young until they're able to fly off and be on their own. So the stork, we identify the stork in our own popular mythology with bringing the young. They're associated with young because they're mindful of the condition of the young. But the opposite is the ostrich. The ostrich will lay its egg and then mindlessly forget where it had laid the egg and buried it in the sand. They will lay their egg and then they will walk over it and crush it. So, and the point of that, I think we'll get to that in Job. When God justifies his ways to Job, he'll say the ostrich has no wisdom with regard to its young. It's careless and will crush it and think nothing of it, so it's not mindful of the next generation. So very strange animals, but the way that he's describing them is very helpful. We can understand why he chooses these to depict the condition that he finds himself in. He says, my skin grows black and falls from me. The blackness here is not a racial comment. Shulamit, the beloved of Solomon in the Song of Songs, describes herself as being black, but in fact, she's talking about she's lost her complexion in the sun, having to work in the sun. And in the ancient world, the fairest complexion was the brightest, and she has lost that because she has to labor like a workman. So her hands are filled with calluses, and she's lost her beauty, is the idea. So he said, his skin grows black and falls from me. That is, the sun shines in its strength and heat upon him, and he's unable to find shelter. He said, my bones burn with fever. And then he concludes with this remarkable imagery. The harp is turned to mourning. My harp is tuned or turned to mourning, and my flute to the voice of those who weep. striking images of contrast here. Both are emblems of music, the harp and the flute, and typically associated with comedy, with rejoicing, with joy. The harp is a percussive instrument. You pluck it. The flute is a wind instrument. But they both have sweet tones to them, and light and uplifting, noble tones. And so they're not usually associated with mourning or with tragedy. But he says, my harp, that is the instrument of expressing my joy, has been turned to mourning, and my flute to the voice of those who weep. They are put to perverse uses, even as he has been, to his mind and within the horizons of his sight, has been put to an ill use, a use for which it was not fashioned or formed, and he cannot understand. So that brings us to the end of chapter 30, which is again a reflection on all that he has lost. 29 looked at what his life was formerly. 30 looks at his life presently and all that has been lost. In the final chapter, which will conclude the words of Job in this book, is chapter 31, where he will take an inventory of every aspect of his life, and he was unable to find any kind of fault that would justify the catastrophe that's come upon him. So we'll look at that next time.
Thank you for listening to the Dr. Warren Gage podcast. If you enjoyed this message, please be sure to like and subscribe to one of our channels so that you never miss an episode. We'd appreciate it if you could also leave us a review. You can find us on drwarrengage.com, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. To support the podcast and gain access to exclusive offers and content from Dr. Warren Gage, please visit our Patreon account at patreon.com/Dr. Warren Gage. We hope you join us next time on the Dr. Warren Gage podcast.